Coming up on Arirang News, the South Korean government finalizes its budget proposal for next year worth 604 trillion won, a record high. That's well over $500 billion, which President Moon says will be directed at an economic recovery. E-commerce giant Amazon starts services in Korea, partnering with the local online retailer 11th Street. This comes as Koreans spend more online to buy things from overseas in the pandemic. And the U.S. has completed the withdrawal of its troops from Afghanistan, slightly ahead of schedule. But the State Department says there are still as many as 200 American civilians still in Afghanistan. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The South Korean government has finalized its budget proposal for next year at a record-breaking 604 trillion won. That's well over $500 billion. The funds will be spent on job creation and helping small businesses hit hardest by the pandemic. Jaein has the details.
The South Korean government's budget for next year has been set at close to $519 billion, an increase of 8.3% from this year.
The pandemic is still ongoing, and we certainly have to overcome this. We must also make inclusive recovery effects to narrow the economic gap and make preemptive investment amid intensifying global competition. So the government should serve as a strong support.
According to the Finance Ministry on Tuesday, some $27 billion will be set aside to create over 2.1 million jobs. Around half of the new jobs will be created in the public sector for older people, people living with disabilities, as well as low-income individuals. The rest will be created in the private sector, partly through a government subsidy of $8,200 to small and medium-sized enterprises for each new person they recruit. To help small business owners survive the pandemic-hit economy, $3.3 billion has been set aside. That's more than 3 times this year's amount. The government will provide low-interest loans to small business owners and provide free legal advice if a business has to declare bankruptcy. On the New Deal project, as the country's going digital, the government will spend $20 million developing metaverse platforms and $26 million on blockchain technology for digital security. $10 billion will be funneled into the Moon administration's goal of achieving zero carbon emissions by 2050. It'll promote the use of eco-friendly cars, fund tree planting projects, and more than 1/5 will be used as climate response funds for slashing greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, some $3 billion will be used to buy more COVID-19 vaccines, mostly mRNA shots. This will include funds to pay for their storage, delivery, and the medical cost of administering them to the public. Jang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in says this final budget of his administration will be aimed at achieving a complete recovery from the COVID-19 crisis and building a stronger economy. At a cabinet meeting Tuesday, he said it's more important than ever to adopt an aggressive fiscal policy, stressing that every effort will be directed toward overcoming the pandemic. The president also pledged support packages for the most vulnerable to reduce the wealth disparity and to strengthen the social safety net. He also highlighted the need to prepare for the future and become a pace-setting nation by boosting investment in new industries such as software and AI and speeding up the green and digital transformations. He asked all ministries to closely work with lawmakers to work for the passage of the budget bill. The South Korean economy has been recovering strongly overall, but in July, data show industrial output and consumption were both down as the fourth wave of the pandemic took hold. But government statisticians say the decline was not as bad as might have been expected. Ji-young has more.
South Korea's industrial output and consumption both dropped in July for the first time in 2 months. According to data released by Statistics Korea on Tuesday, the nation's overall industrial production index stood at 112.1 last month, down 0.5% compared to June. It's a reversal from June's 1.6% growth. The overall drop in production was led by fall in the output of face-to-face services, including restaurants and accommodation, which fell by around 5%, and sports and leisure activities, which dropped by 5.5%. The car industry also saw production slump by around 4%. On the other hand, the mining and manufacturing sector saw output rise by 0.4%, led by an increase in system semiconductor production. The service sector also edged up 0.2%, mainly driven by the wholesale and retail sector and the IT sector.
Despite the growing uncertainties amid the fourth wave of the pandemic, mining, manufacturing and service industries have shown an increase in output, and retail sales have fallen by a relatively small amount. We believe that the economy has shown better than expected results.
Consumption in July also fell by about 0.6% amid the social distancing measures, with clothing and cars seeing large drops. Spending by the public administration sector decreased by 8.3% on month, which was the largest decrease in about 8 years. This was due to lower spending on vaccine purchases in July. Finance Minister Hong Nam-ki said on his social media that while the impact of the fourth wave was inevitable, the decrease has been smaller than previous waves of the pandemic. 엄지영, Arirang News.
South Korean companies have been building bridges with global e-commerce companies, especially in the pandemic, enabling Korean shoppers to more easily buy things from overseas. Now the world's biggest e-commerce company, Amazon, is opening services here in partnership with a major local player, 11th Street. Those services begin today. Our Choi Won-jong spoke with an expert to find out what changes this might bring.
The e-commerce game in South Korea is changing. The global e-commerce giant Amazon is kicking off its services in Korea, partner with the local online retailer 11th Street. Starting Tuesday, Korean consumers who for a long time have had to pay more and wait longer for overseas purchases can use these services to easily pay for Amazon products in Korean currency and receive their orders in 6 to 10 days.
As cross-border shopping continues to grow, Amazon has opened its global services using the platform of the Korean company 11th Street to help with the language barrier and search process, and to create an easy shopping environment like people have in Korea.
Because the pandemic has prevented people from going overseas to shop, more consumers are instead going online for these purchases. Data showed the approximate amount spent last year by Korean consumers through overseas online retailers was around $3.5 billion. But just in the first half of 2021, they spent $2.1 billion, which will put them on a much higher trajectory this year.
So what's going to change in South Korea's local e-commerce industries as these two giants are partnering together? Experts say consumers won't see many changes just yet.
Amazon is not going to shake up the domestic e-commerce market right away by going through the Korean company 11th Street, because the so-called Big Three, Naver, Coupang and eBay, are well settled in Korea already, and many other companies are chasing them.
But this could be the start of a new era of global competition by e-commerce targeting Korean consumers.
The e-commerce industry right now is about reaching out to the global market online and expanding the online purchasing options overseas. I think Amazon has been looking for the right time to enter the Korean market.
The expert added that the key point to watch will be Amazon's goal in Korea long term, whether it's entering the market in earnest or just trying to maintain what cooperation it has with local e-commerce companies. Choi Won-jong, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon. Thanks for making time today.
Good afternoon.
Well, let's start with the markets. Stocks on Wall Street, with the exception of the Dow, continuing the rise we saw last Friday. That, of course, based on remarks by Jerome Powell and others that the Fed could start tapering this year, but won't be in a hurry to raise interest rates. The S&P and the Nasdaq at new highs. What's the story in the global markets?
Right. If you look at the U.S. market, S&P 500 was up about 0.43%, but particularly the NASDAQ was up 0.9%. Now it's breaking well above 15,265. Clearly, the direction seems to be quite strong, where the NASDAQ or the growth stocks are doing very, very strongly. Main reason for that kind of drive is because if you look at the U.S. government rate, the 10-year bond rates now hitting at around below 1.3%. Clearly, the indication is that the interest rate environment is not going to be that aggressive per se. As you said, if you look at the tapering timeline, it could be accelerated probably by the end of this year because they have provided such high level of the asset purchasing program. So the speed of that was 3 times higher than the 2008 financial crisis, and therefore the speed of reduction should be as fast also. However, that does not mean that the central bank will be tightening through the rate hike. If you look at the environment, as we can see, the interest rate environment remains to be very low with 1.3% of 10-year government bond rate, and the inflationary pressure seems to be dwindling down as the month passes by. We think that there's no major reason why the inflation should remain where it is. As the time passes by, as the U.S. economy stabilizes, rather, it was pent-up demand that pushed up the growth rate. But going forward, we estimate that the U.S. real GDP growth rate should remain at around 2.5% per se in a longer-term basis. If that's the case, the pressure for the inflation is not going to be that particularly strong. So having said that, such a low rate environment to be continued in the future means that the growth stocks would look very attractive. So particularly the FANG and MAGA or various these large cap, the tech companies were showing somewhere between 1 to 3% rise yesterday, and that trend can continue to happen as the interest rate environment remains to be very low.
Well, today in Korea, the Kospi and the Kosdaq started out quite shaky, but both recovered strongly in the afternoon. On the Kospi today, interesting to see foreigners buying and local institutions and individuals selling. Tell us about the domestic market.
Yes. If you look at the Korean market, the Kospi was up very strongly, almost hitting 3,200 territory, rising by 1.75%. And that is because of the massive net purchasing by the foreign investors, total of 1.2 trillion won worth of it. And quite a bit is coming into the Samsung Electronics and the semiconductor industries. The sector of that was the leading sector that made the market to fall, but now foreigners coming back, making the market to go up quite strongly. I guess the local investors were quite perturbed or confused with this kind of movement. We've been saying that as of beginning of this week, if you look at the relative valuation of the Korean market and also the emerging market, it is probably on a relative basis as low as when we saw the Asian financial crisis or the 2001 9/11 crisis. This is the relative valuations or relative price movement since in the last 20 years. So if we are at that kind of low level, meaning that the U.S. market has risen so much versus the Asian market and Korean market, the emerging market did not rise that much. We thought that there's no reason for Korean market to fall further from the current level, but rather towards the end of this year, we could see quite strong recovery of Kospi as well as the emerging market. So we continue to remain quite bullish on Korea. We do think that by the end of this year, Kospi can break 3,500 plus, even maybe 3,600 basis on valuations. If you look at the earnings growth rate, it is at 75% this year. The dividend yield is expected to be rising to as high as 4%. All that being said, we think that the Korean market looks very attractive at the current valuation.
Well, shifting gears here, we've seen a spike in oil prices this week because of Hurricane Ida hitting production in the Gulf of Mexico, still below the high that we saw a month and a half ago. And this spike could be temporary, with OPEC plus countries to meet on Wednesday and reportedly planning to stick with a production increase. Where do you see oil prices going from here?
Right. Clearly, the oil price is going to be giving us mixed signals. We've been saying that it should be box trading somewhere between $65 to $75 range, maybe a bit even lower to $60 to $70 range on the basis of demand and supply. As you know, if you look at China, most of the PMI numbers are showing that it is slowing down per se. Also, globally, we're seeing some bit of a modest growth rate expected in the future, which means that oil demand is not going to be that particularly strong compared to 2011 cycle. So if that's the case, with all these alternative energy supplies that are coming through, as well as the shale gas supplies, and also the additional injection by the OPEC plus, all that means is that we think that the oil price cannot go up that much relative to what we saw of about $77 per barrel a few weeks ago. We think that the range bound should happen and that the demand of the economy should be reasonable, not particularly overheating. Also, it's not going to be to the deflationary environment. So we think that the overall activity should be in a Goldilocks area, period, and that would result into oil price movement of a trading range. So once again, oil price would remain most likely somewhere between $60 to $70 range.
And finally, some economic data in Korea. The fourth wave of the pandemic has hit overall production, notably retail sales declining slightly in July from the month before, though still much better than a year ago. Significant production declines in other areas of the economy, too. So the virus weighing heavily right now. Tell us about that.
Right. I think that when we look at on a month-to-month basis, we are seeing clearly a slowdown because when we had a very strong recovery post-pandemic, most of the pent-up demand had followed through and resulting into quite strong retail sales number. But as you said, with the COVID variant, Delta variant, people are concerned, and also there's continuation of the uncertainty regarding how fast the spread will happen versus the vaccination speed, how that will be relatively differ. So all being said, we did see month-on-month basis the falling of the retail sales. But nevertheless, if you look at on a year-on-year basis, it is quite strong growth rate of 7.9%. So I think that it's a bit of a more normalization rather than, say, a recessionary or, once again, uncertainties. I think that also if you look at the industrial output as well and construction output, all that indicates that economy is going to be growing at a reasonable pace rather than overheated pace. Also, there is a presidential election next year, so maybe some of these construction output are going to be maybe be delayed, but government is coming out with ample supply of the housing for in the future, and also the economic activity on global scale should be fairly reasonable with the export numbers remain quite strong. So all that means that the industrial output as well as retail sales should be a reasonable pace of growth rate, which means that we think that the overall market should not be too concerned, or the overall economic growth rate should not be too concerned at this point in time.
Got it. All right, Mr. Yu, we'll have to leave it there for today and see how things look again at the end of the week. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
The United States has officially completed the withdrawal of all its troops from Afghanistan, leaving the Taliban presumably to rule the country. The last of the troops left Monday night, actually a day before President Biden's deadline. There were celebrations in Kabul, but still Secretary of State Blinken says there are a number of American civilians still there, numbering fewer than 200. Kim Hyun-sung has this report.
The Pentagon on Monday said that the U.S. had pulled the last of its forces out of Afghanistan, finally ending its 20-year military presence in the country. The last flight, a C-17 aircraft, took off from Kabul on Monday night, carrying the last load of people out of Afghanistan, a day earlier than the promised deadline of August 31st. A total of 123,000 people, including 6,000 Americans, have been safely evacuated.
This has been a massive military, diplomatic, and humanitarian undertaking, one of the most difficult in our nation's history, and an extraordinary feat of logistics and coordination under some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable.
But Blinken said that a small number of less than 200 Americans are still in Afghanistan, and the U.S. will work relentlessly to safely evacuate them. The U.S. also continues a diplomatic mission with Afghanistan, but has currently relocated that mission to Qatar. After the U.S. troops had left, celebrations rang across Kabul. Shots were fired into the air. People honked and whistled on the streets.
During these 20 years, the Americans have done a lot of damage to the Afghan state. What will happen to the Afghan state after this? I appeal to all our political leaders, elders, and young people. Let's take our matters into our own hands.
Taliban spokesman Qari Yusuf said during an interview with Al Jazeera that the country had gained complete independence as the U.S. troops had finally pulled out. And another spokesman, Zabidullah Mujahid, tweeted his praise and gratitude to God. But not everyone joined in the celebrations. Many people, especially women, remain in danger under the Taliban rule. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
South Korea and the U.S. have agreed on the need to swiftly reopen dialogue with North Korea for denuclearization. This comes as the IAEA reports that the regime appears to have restarted activity at the Yongbyon nuclear complex, possibly trying to gain leverage in eventual talks. Jae Min-jung reports.
The U.S. Special Envoy for North Korea has expressed his hope for bringing the regime back to the dialogue table. Sung Kim and his South Korean counterpart No Gyudok held a meeting in Washington, D.C. on Monday and exchanged ideas and initiatives for the regime's engagement, including the possibility of humanitarian aid.
We also, of course, reaffirmed our shared commitment to pursuing the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula through diplomacy, and I look forward to hearing back from the DPRK.
South Korea's chief nuclear envoy added that the government has continued to keep a close eye on North Korea's nuclear activities.
The government has been monitoring North Korea's activities related to WMDs through cooperation with the U.S.
Both sides agreed that the North Korean nuclear issue is an urgent matter that needs to be resolved through diplomacy and dialogue. The discussions between the U.S. and South Korean senior officials comes after the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that the regime appears to have restarted operations at a plutonium-producing reactor in Yongbyon. The White House also confirmed that it is aware of the matter. Speaking at a press briefing on Monday, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said the report released by the UN Nuclear Agency highlights the urgent need for dialogue and diplomacy to achieve complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The Yongbyon reactor is known to have been inactive from December 2018 until the beginning of July this year, but the IAEA's report says there has been indications of operation since early last month. Jae Min-jung, Arirang News.
South Korea today reported 1,372 new cases of COVID-19. The first time in 2 weeks the daily caseload's been below 1,400. Of those transmitted locally, around 70% were in the capital region. The current social distancing measures expire on Sunday, so on Friday, the government will announce new measures for the month of September. It'll also announce special measures for the upcoming Chuseok holiday when millions travel across the country to see family. Those will likely include limits on the size of gatherings and the rules for nursing home visits. It looks like Korea's unionized healthcare workers will be going ahead with a strike this Thursday after talks fell through with the government today. Medical staff saying they're overworked and demanding better working conditions in the pandemic. The two sides have held 12 rounds of talks. The Korean Health and Medical Workers Union, representing more than 56,000 nurses, pharmacists, and others, but not doctors, has demanded the addition of more public hospitals and personnel. Many nurses have quit or taken leave, saying they're burnt out and compensated too little for their rigorous schedules. Health Minister Kwon Duk-chul has urged against the strike due to concerns about an already burdened healthcare system. California has ordered people to evacuate the popular resort destination of Lake Tahoe as the massive Caldor fire moves closer. The evacuation order issued Monday covers South Lake Tahoe, home to some 22,000 people, causing traffic jams on all the roads leading out. The fire is spreading rapidly due to strong winds, and the terrain is making the fire difficult to stop. As of Monday night, the fire, which broke out a little over 2 weeks ago, has burned more than 290 square miles, an area larger than Chicago. The authorities have pushed back the projected date for full containment from early this week to September 8th. And that does it for this newscast. Thank you for watching.